After Effects basic workshop for everyone. So is that you guys are all in the right place? You're all here to learn a little bit about After Effects? Excellent. So when I teach a program, there's always a struggle between who in the audience, like who knows what. Some people have a little bit of experience with it. Some people are brand new. Where do you guys all sit? Have you never touched any After Effects before, or have you touched it before? You kind of know what you're doing. You're just looking for some help, or how many of you are like brand new? Played with it.
Really anything.
So there's a few of you who are maybe brand new and never touched After Effects before. Okay, that's cool. So I'm going to kind of cater to the people who have never touched it before because I want to make sure everyone has a little bit of an understanding. And my teaching style is very much, I mean, I'm here to help you, and this is such a small group, and we can kind of be interactive. So if you're not too shy and you're feeling up to it, please feel free to stop me and ask me questions as I go along. I like to just keep things open and casual. And I know that a lot of you I don't think any of you have laptops that you're kind of playing along with, so I'll just kind of try to do this. Hopefully if you want to take notes, you can. I'm sure we can always go back and kind of review the video, so that'll be really nice. So okay, I have After Effects open up on my screen, and typically when After Effects opens, it's going to open and have this sort of startup menu kind of pop up for you. Some people really like this menu. I don't particularly use it, and some of the tutorials that I've watched to kind of get some tips on how to explain After Effects to people, they also don't really like to use it, but it does offer you a few different things. So as you can see, you can start a new project here. You can open a project that's existing. If you have done some work in After Effects before, there will be a list of the projects that you've worked on, and you can just click on those as links to open up those projects. So it can be a nice little window, but I typically don't use it. And the reason I don't use it is because even though it has this button that says New Project, all of this stuff that is happening behind this menu is a new project already, so it's a little redundant. So I just go ahead and close that window. So this is After Effects. It's a very powerful program, and there are a lot of different things that you can do with it. And there are some areas of After Effects that I myself am not even very well versed in. For instance, I don't do a lot of visual effects and compositing. I'm more of the animation side of things and motion graphics. So you can be really well versed in one part of the use of the program and maybe not know a ton about the other stuff. So depending on what you all would like to learn, hopefully we'll cover a bit of everything to kind of give you a good basics and how the program works, what the tools are, and what you can do with it. So I will give you a little tour of the interface. Typically, After Effects will open up looking like this. I feel like just with the way the projector is working, it's a little bit kind of shrunk and condensed, especially if you're working on the laptop and can be kind of a small amount of real estate that you're working with as far as your screen. So a lot of professional people like to use a double monitor or a very large monitor when they're working with After Effects, but there are ways to work around that, and it just kind of goes along with getting to know what all of these different windows are, what they do, and kind of how to shrink or minimize them to your liking. So let's just kind of get started. As you can see, when I move my mouse to the different windows of After Effects, there is a blue line that kind of outlines each panel that I'm clicking on. So that's just kind of a nice way to know where you are in the program and kind of what piece is active and what you're looking at. So I will start kind of talking about what each piece is. So right here we have the project panel. I'm not super familiar with Premiere, but I do know that if you are, there is a similar sort of bin that you can house objects in or footage and things in Premiere. So After Effects kind of works similarly, where anything that you import into your project, any assets that you bring in are going to live in the project window. So you'll see that there's nothing in my file right now, but underneath the name, you know, there is a blank gray space that's kind of waiting to be filled up with whatever I want to bring in. So this is my project window. Again, that probably doesn't make any sense now since there's nothing in there. Next to that, we have the composition window. Right now, because we don't have a composition, it's giving me the options these two buttons to either start a new composition or to start a new composition from footage. Again, I don't usually use those buttons. I kind of do everything myself manually, but those are really nice buttons to get used to if you kind of want to do something sort of instant. So the composition window is also kind of like your screen. Once I bring some footage in here, this is where I'm going to be able to view the footage, where I will see what is happening in my project. So this window will change once I start to bring some stuff in. Next to that, we've got a couple of different windows. Well, actually, they're not really windows. I guess some people call these drawers, because when you click on them, they will open or close. So these are a few different menus. You can change them, you can close them, you can open up different ones. The default After Effects will sort of have these few up here, and these all do their own thing. We can get into this stuff a little bit later. But just know you can click on them and open them up, and click on them again, it will close them back up. And the blue line will be there to tell you which one you have active. Last, down at the bottom, we have the timeline. So there's really nothing happening here because I don't have any assets in the project yet. But this is where a lot of stuff is going to happen. If any of you are familiar with time-based media, you're going to have your standard playhead, and you'll have your time code, and you'll be able to find your place in time linearly. It's also going to give you an area for layers to exist. So once I do start bringing assets in, the layers will kind of hang out down here in the timeline, and my compositions will also show up down here. Any questions on this so far? Okay, pretty self-explanatory, pretty simple. At the top, not the very top where the menus are, but right below where it says After Effects, we do have a toolbar. Myself, I typically work with shorthand commands, and so there are a lot of really cool shorthand commands that you can get to know to switch very quickly between the different tools. But I will kind of explain why I'm using which tool and how I'm activating it. So if there's ever a moment where I switch to a new tool and any of you are confused and want to know what's happening or what I'm doing, feel free to ask me. Excuse me. Okay. So, let's see, I think that's all I wanted to cover as far as the interface. So let's talk about sort of the catch-all phrase for a project in After Effects. What we call projects in After Effects are compositions, or comps. And comps are a little bit abstract. It took me a while to get my brain wrapped around them. They're basically kind of a housing for all of your layers and assets in After Effects in time. So it's different than the project because the project sort of houses everything in a different way. Again, it's a little bit of an abstract concept. So let me start to bring some assets in so I can kind of show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and import the MTN logo in here. You can import multiple different kinds of files into After Effects and work with lots of different things. You can import video footage, you can import Photoshop files, JPEG images, any kinds of photos, many, many things. So the way to do that, there's a couple of ways to do that. The way that I really like to do it is by shorthand command, but I will show you the long way first before, excuse me. Val, maybe I will take you up on that water. I'm getting like a dry throat, sorry. So by clicking on any of these menus at the top of After Effects, the different options that you can choose will give you a shorthand command next to it. So here in the composition menu, you can see I could choose new composition, but I'm not going to actually create a composition that way just yet. I'm going to import a file first. So under the File menu, you'll see that there's an option to import, and I'm going to just go ahead and choose File. Thank you. Sorry, I feel like I'm getting the cold that's kind of going around these days. Okay, so once I choose File, Import File, After Effects is going to open up a navigation window and let me navigate to wherever I'm housing files on my computer and what I want to bring in. So I have made a little folder for our little session tonight. Let me try to find that. Oh, did you have a question?
Can you import, can you convert files with After Effects? Like a TIFF to a JPEG or a bitmap to a JPEG?
I think technically you probably could, but I would prefer something like Photoshop to do that. I think it's just a little bit quicker and easier to do so in Photoshop. But that's a good question. Okay, so I have this After Effects folder here, and I have some logos that I have saved. So you can see I have a few different kinds of files. I have a JPEG, a PNG, a PSD, and another PNG. So they all do different things. I'm just going to go ahead and import the MTM logo white PNG. Hit open. So now you can see this project window has changed a little bit. So you can see that the MTM logo that I've imported now lives down here. And if I have it highlighted, you'll see the project panel is activated, and you can get a little bit of information. It'll tell you the size of it. So this is 1080 by 1080. And it's got millions of colors, it has a straight alpha matte, and it's non-interlaced. So that's all kind of stuff that you probably don't need to know. But you can see that your image has now been imported, and it is living in the project file. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to import some video footage. So I'm going to do that same thing that I just showed you. I'm going to go File, Import, and File. If you notice, the shorthand command for that is just Command-I. So I'm going to actually do Command-I so you can see how that works. So I'm going to get out of that File menu and just on my keyboard hit Command-I. So again, same thing. This dialog box will open, and it typically likes to kind of stay in the same folder that you last used. So I can just go right back in and grab another one of these images if I want to. But I'm actually going to go up a step and grab this footage. So I have this footage that I kind of took last time I was out in LA. I got to go out to the Palisades, and I've never really been out there, so that was super fancy for me. So I took a quick iPhone movie. So it's not a super high quality movie, it's just from my iPhone, just the standard basic settings. But as you can see, the icon's a little bit different. Also, this is a .mov file, so you can see the extension is different than the PNG. Also, when I click on it, you can see up in the project window, it's telling me the name of it. It's saying it's 1920 by 1080. And then it's giving me a frame rate. So do most of you work in time-based media? Do you guys all know what frame rate is? Or is that kind of a new concept to you? Okay, everybody knows what frame rate is. Obviously, just in case somebody had no idea what frame rate is, frames are the amount of images that are being displayed per second of film. So this one's coming in at the standard 29.97 frames, and I think that that's pretty typical for film or for movies or digital files. Again, I'm an animator, so I work in slightly different frame rates. Yes?
With After Effects, can you up the resolution of the logo? And or can you, is there a composition to go with frame rate and resolution for the whole?
Okay, so frame rate and resolution are different. So frame rate is, like if I were to take 1 second of film and break it up into fractions that are just images that are being displayed, I mean, you know what frame rate is. So that's kind of like in time. Frame rate is how many images you're seeing in time. When you're talking about an image like a PNG, like the logo here, this one actually doesn't exist in time. It's a solid image that's kind of a constant, and the resolution is referring to the pixels that are making it up on the display. So you can't really add more pixels to something and make it look clean and smooth. So if something is 1080 pixels, you can't blow it up to 5,000 pixels and expect it to sort of stay nice and clean unless it's a vector-based. But this one is not. This one is a PNG. Vector-based images are usually images that are created in a program like Illustrator And the way that they are created is with a mathematic algorithm that kind of keeps everything nice and clean and sharp, so you don't need to rely so much on the digital information in it. It's more that kind of mathematic algorithm.
The reason why I ask is because images coming out with that at new resolution, you have to take that
Sure. Like 4K or something? Right.
well, it will upscale or downscale the resolution as needed even with animation and gaming.
Hmm.
It's a new piece of software that's designed to basically fill in pixels on images.
Okay.
So it's basically, it will work for like images, like scaling them up, and it will work for like textures in like games. Like
Sure.
the textures look on older games look better by filling in pixels.
Okay. Maybe it's using some kind of mathematical algorithm to like come up with the information that it is like. So I know that there are things like in Photoshop that you can kind of fill in some information that's not there by pulling from the background images. So maybe it's the same kind of concept. I have not heard that, so I guess I don't have. Say that again?
It was called, it was, as they put it, it was intelligent learning speed.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, no, that's not something I have really any experience with, so I'm sorry I don't really have an answer for you on that. But that's a good question.
Well, I'm not surprised you don't have experience on it. It's not out
It's
there.
kind of brand new, yeah. And you know, and the kind of animation that I do is I typically do traditional hand-drawn animation. So I use After Effects to kind of bring all of my drawings together. So like my background layer, my characters, maybe my foreground layers. So I'm not really a 3D person. That sounds like maybe more like film, game 3D. So again, that's outside of my wheelhouse just a little.
2D images, it's a new piece of software.
Yeah.
That recently came out.
Okay. No, that sounds really interesting though. That's cool.
To fill in pixels.
Okay. Okay, well, cool. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you on that. But yeah, so let's get back to, let's just make a quick little movie out of these elements that I have sort of brought into After Effects. So I brought this movie in. I can double click on it and it will open it up in my composition window. And this is sort of just a snapshot of the film, or the movie, I guess. There's a little timeline here and I can scrub through and kind of watch it. But this is not actually the film being, the digital image, the movie being brought into the composition and creating something in my timeline. This is just kind of a quick snapshot of it. So you'll see that there are some tabs that have opened up here. There's one called footage and then the name of my footage, and then there's the composition that I haven't named yet. That's sort of just my default composition. So I can click back on this tab and it will show me these buttons again. Since I have this open, I can click back on that to look at it, but if I don't want to see that anymore, I can just close that out. And these windows are adjustable, so if you hover your mouse over, you know, the line in between them till your icon kind of changes to that double arrow, you can click and drag to make them bigger or smaller. Also, excuse me, you can click and drag a lot of these windows around and kind of just put them wherever you want. But if you're clicking and you're dragging and you're kind of making a big mess out of your After Effects and you're like, oh, what did I do? I don't know how to get back to like my composition, my viewer. I don't know where my screen went. There's a really nice shortcut to kind of get back to where you were. So there are all of these menus here at the top. The one that says Window has a Workspace submenu, and in that you'll see that there is an option to reset default to saved layout. So you can just go ahead and click on that and it'll put everything back to the way it was default for you. So I have this footage in my project panel. There's a couple different ways I can kind of start a composition using that footage. I can either click on it and drag it down here into my timeline and release it, and it will put it here in my composition. So now I actually have a movie that's showing up. You'll see my timeline looks a little bit different. I've got the time code here. I've got the name of the layer right here. And I have the playhead, and I can kind of drag that through my footage. If I hit the space bar, that is a shortcut to preview my footage. So I'm going to go ahead and hit space bar. It's like the sound is coming from my computer, so I'm sorry, it's kind of It's not very interesting sound. It's just sort of waves playing. So the first time that After Effects is kind of going through and previewing that, it's doing a RAM preview. So it's kind of putting all of those frames into its RAM memory, or memory. And after this line has turned green up here, that means that it has all of those frames sort of in memory, and it will play it at real time for you, typically. The bigger your files get, the slower things go, and the more bogged down your system gets. But if it's just a simple piece of footage like this, you can kind of sit here and watch it. So I'm going to hit spacebar, and that will stop it. And so you can see I can just sort of drag this timeline back or this playhead back and forth. You can also zoom in and out on your timeline down here. So there are these icons at the bottom that look sort of, I think of them as mountains. So this one, if I click on it, I'm kind of zooming into my timeline. You can see that the information up here changes from frames. Right now I'm seeing 1 frame at a time. If I start to zoom out, it goes to every 2 frames, every 5 frames, and so on and so forth until I'm kind of zoomed out and I can see the entire timeline. Also, if I wanted to go somewhere very precise in my timeline, instead of kind of dragging my playhead and then looking over here at my time code to sort of see like, oh, if I want to get to frame 320, I'm gonna, like, oops, I went too far, oops, I went too far the other way. You can simply just click on this time code and type in where you want to go. So if I want to go to frame 320, it's actually not frame 320. The way time code goes, are most of you familiar with time code? I'm assuming that you people are, film production. If you're not, it is, it starts over, I guess from the right, I would say there's frames, minutes, seconds, and hours. So this is 3 seconds and 20 frames. So any questions on this so far? Is all kind of making sense? Okay, I'm hoping I'm not simplifying it too much or going over anything to like making it too complicated for those of you who've maybe never touched After Effects before. So let me pull in the logo here, and we will put this on top of our footage, and then we'll kind of start talking about keyframes and kind of setting up some animation and stuff in After Effects and just do a simple animated logo, I guess. So I'm just gonna grab this logo and I'm gonna drag it down into the timeline. And you see there's kind of a highlighted blue line there. That's just After Effects saying, hey, do you want this layer to appear underneath this other layer, on top of it? So you can kind of choose where you want it to go. Then once I release the mouse, it will just kind of plop it down there in the composition. I'm gonna do that a different way just so you can see some different ways to do that. So I'm going to undo what I just did, and the easiest shortcut to undo something is Command-Z. So I'm going to hit Command-Z, and that will undo that. You can also grab the PNG and just dump it right here on your composition window. Wherever you let go of it is where it's going to kind of land. And you can click and move this around in your composition wherever you like. So again, I'm going to undo that. And if you notice, when I grab this and just release it on the timeline, After Effects kind of places it right nice and neat in the center. So you don't really have to think about it super hard. Like, is that centered? It's just there for you. So now if I go ahead and hit play, there's nothing happening to my logo, but you can see that the logo is its own layer here, and it exists on the layer above the footage layer. So I've got those 2 layers. And I can change the order of them by just simply clicking and dragging. So if I drag the logo underneath the footage, obviously you can't see it because it lives underneath that. There are a couple of different buttons and things down here in the timeline. So there is this eyeball that is something that you can just toggle on and off. So I can click the eyeball and turn that footage off, and I can see that my logo is living underneath that footage layer. Toggle that back on. Same thing with this little sound icon. If I didn't want the sound on there, I can just turn that sound off, and then when I hit play, it's just showing me the visuals and it's not showing me the sound. And so I want my logo to actually live on top of my footage, so I'm just going to change that layer order again. So any questions on this so far? Okay, so let's see. I think I would like to talk about animation now. So I'm gonna do like a simple fade on for the logo, and then we can kind of get into some other kinds of animations. So each layer in the timeline of After Effects has these little triangles kind of next to them. They sort of live next to this colored square, which corresponds with what type of layer it is. So the purple square, or I guess this lavender color, is telling me that I have an image, whereas this sort of turquoise is saying this is a footage layer. So next to it there is a triangle that you can click and twirl down, and it will give me some transform properties, which again has another arrow. So I'm going to click and twirl that down. And I'm kind of just using 2 fingers to scroll on the trackpad to sort of scroll up and down to reveal all of these different layers. If the screen is kind of getting tight, the real estate isn't so much, you can kind of move this up a little bit so that will reveal all of those properties in the layer. So I just do a lot of kind of scrolling around. Also, I forgot to say that in the composition window here, same thing, if I just use a double finger scroll, I can zoom way out, and then I can also zoom way in. If you do something where you get really lost and you don't really know where you are in your composition window, there is a button down here that's the magnification ratio. So you can just click that and choose fit up to 100%, and that should frame things back up for you so you can see where you are. So back to the timeline, I like to usually make sure any animation that I'm doing, I'm always aware of where I am in time. So I kind of always scoop my little playhead back up to that 0 frame. And I'm looking at all of these properties that have been revealed under the transform. These all have these sort of little, I think it's probably really hard to see, but they're little stopwatch icons right next to every property. That's telling me that all of those properties are keyframeable. And what I mean by keyframes is that I can change the value of that and I can animate it over time. So I'm going to do it to the opacity and kind of create a fade. So right now my opacity is at 100%. I can click and drag on this value and bring it up or down, and that will change the opacity for me. I can also just click on that value and it will let me type in whatever value I'd like to put in. So if I just go ahead and put 0 in and hit enter, then it's completely transparent. I can't see that logo. I'm going to go ahead and click the stopwatch icon, and what that's doing is it's going to start an initial keyframe. Yeah, did you have a question?
Can you change the opacity on a video clip, or is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you can. Here, I'll do that for you. Just to kind of show you that you can do it. As long as it has the property underneath in the transform values, you can go in and kind of change that. Yeah. So you can kind of layer up different clips and videos. So I'll twirl that back up just to keep it kind of clean. So if you notice now back at the opacity on the logo layer, once I clicked that keyframe, a few things happened, or once I clicked the stopwatch, a few things happened. So this little diamond has appeared over to my left. And that's basically saying like, hey, there's some keyframe properties on this particular value. Also over here in my timeline, where my playhead is, there's this tiny little diamond that has appeared, and that is my keyframe. So that is basically, if I zoom way in, it kind of doesn't look like anything, but can you guys all see that? There's that blue diamond that's appeared there. That is saying to After Effects, at this point in time, I want this value to be this much. So if I move forward now in time with my playhead to, say, frame 20, and I bring this back up to 100 and hit enter, After Effects is going to automatically add another keyframe for me, and then it's going to in between that value between those 2 keyframes. So as I sort of scrub the playhead, it will kind of go through that fade for me. So I'm really zoomed into the timeline. I'm going to kind of zoom out, and then I'm just going to hit the space bar so you can kind of see what that looks like. So any questions on that? So adding keyframes to layers and on different properties in After Effects is something that takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of just kind of doing it over and over again to kind of get used to how it works. There are some subtle nuances with the keyframes that you kind of have to learn about. But the basic properties of it are, once you activate that stopwatch, you're telling After Effects, like, allow this property to become keyframeable so that I can change the value over time. So anytime I go forward in time and make a change to this value that has a keyframe on it, After Effects is going to automatically add a keyframe for me. So I don't even really have to think about it. However, if I wanted it to kind of go up to 100% and stay at 100% before it started fading back down to 0, I have to kind of think about time and value and kind of finagle some things so that it's doing what I want it to do. So right now, I just kind of added this third keyframe here, and I just randomly hit 24%. So now if I bring my playhead to the beginning and hit the space bar, it goes up, and then right away it starts to fade back down to that 24%. So let's say that's not what I want it to do. I want to change those values. So first of all, if I wanted to change the value of this keyframe, I need to make sure that my playhead is over that keyframe exactly. And sometimes that can be hard to tell where you are in space. So I like to sort of bring the playhead as close as I think it is to that value, and then start to zoom in. Sometimes you'll think you're right on top of that keyframe and you'll be a frame over. Then you'll start to change values and you'll add extra keyframes, and you kind of can start to get frustrated with some of the stuff that happens in After Effects. So it's a nice practice to get into, to just kind of zoom in and start to make sure that you're very precise about your keyframes. So now, with my playhead right over that keyframe, I can go ahead and change that value. I'm going to change it to, let's change it to 100, hit enter, and then I'm going to zoom back out. So what I'm telling After Effects now is start at 0, fade up to 100% at frame 20, stay at 100% until frame 129, and then I'm just going to go forward again, just kind of an arbitrary amount, and I'm going to type in the value 0. So that I have the logo sort of fading on, staying on for a moment, and then fading back off. So now another thing that I'm kind of noticing that's happening is maybe I just want to watch the area where I have the keyframes in my timeline, but as I hit spacebar, After Effects is just continuing to play kind of this dead space that I have after those keyframes have been created. So you can absolutely change sort of the range of what you're being shown, and that is by changing what's called the in and out points in After Effects. So let me zoom way out. So you'll notice here at the very top of the timeline, there's this sort of lighter gray bar that's kind of bookended with these little blue, I guess, rectangles. So those are my in and out points, or like my range, my, I guess, time range. I can click and drag these and make them sort of shorter, and as you bring them down, you'll see that the area that is being active is a little bit lighter gray, and whatever is not going to be shown to you is this darker gray. So you kind of have a visual of what's being shown and what's not. So I am going to just kind of set those up so they're just encompassing those keyframes. That way when I hit play, it's just going to show me what's in that kind of time range. So any questions on this stuff so far? Cool. So that's kind of the basics of bringing something in and starting to change the value of, I guess, an image in After Effects. A really good habit to get into, as most of you know, is to save your work and save it often, because a lot of times with time-based media, your program's going to crash on you and you might lose some work. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this project. It's going to bring up a dialog box because I've never saved this before. So I'm going to just go ahead and name it MTN logo. And I'm going to go ahead and save it, let's see, in that folder that has the AE stuff. So you don't need to name it with any kind of special extension or anything. It's just going to save it as an Adobe After Effects project, and you can hit save. So something else that I would like to talk about that kind of coincides with saving is that After Effects references whatever objects it is that you're bringing into your project. So it's not actually making a copy of this footage or this logo. It's actually just referencing where it is on my desktop. So again, when you're working in After Effects, it's a really good idea to stay organized with your files and have a good system and a hierarchy, and then once you create it, don't move it. I'll show you what happens when you do move things. So if I go back into our folder, I have this AE, so After Effects folder. I've got my footage in here, I've got my logos in here. So let's say I wanted to move all of these logos outside of this folder. I'm going to dump them right here, just in my After Effects folder. Once I go back to After Effects, it's gonna be really unhappy with me and basically say like, hey, I just lost one of my references. I don't have it. I'm gonna insert this sort of, I don't know, I can't remember what that image is called, sort of this like color swatch here. It's just gonna insert that for wherever that object was, and it's gonna say I'm missing this and I can't find it. So you just click OK, and then wherever that was in your file, it's just gonna show you this kind of color-coded swatch. So it's very easy to fix, but it's a pretty common mistake, I think, for a lot of the students that I teach. My first-time students working with After Effects don't really understand this concept of something being referenced versus actually having a copy inside of the file. So there are a few different ways to remedy the situation. You can either just go back and put those images back into that folder. Then when you go back into After Effects, you have to reload the footage. So you do that by sort of right-clicking on whatever is missing. I'm working on a Mac, and I don't have a mouse with me, but I have my trackpad set up for double-clicking. So I'm just using a 2-finger click, and then it kind of lets me right-click on it. But otherwise, if you just have a mouse or if you work on a PC, you just right-click. Right on the word in the project window, and it will bring up a menu for you. And so you have a couple of different options, one of them being reload footage. So I can just choose that one, and it will kind of reload everything and re-reference that file and bring it right in for you. Otherwise, let me show you another way that you can do that. So if I were to come in here and break this link again and kind of pull all those folders out of that, I'm gonna get that same error message. So I'm gonna hit OK. And then instead of going and moving my files to try to remember what my hierarchy was in the first place, which can be really daunting if you forgot, you can simply right-click on that file and you can choose Replace Footage and then choose File from that next sub-menu. And then you can navigate to where that file has been moved to. And you can just click on, you can either double-click on it or you can just simply select it and hit Open, and it will reload the file for you. So any questions on that so far? Okay, so I think the last thing I sort of want to cover will be some of these other properties that you can change, and then we'll talk a little bit about rendering. So you can change all of these other properties that have the stopwatches next to them. A couple of them that I want to talk about are sort of connected to something called the anchor point in your image. So the center of this MTN logo, if I zoom in here, has this, maybe it's a little hard to see. Oh no, you can see it pretty well. It has this sort of like bullseye character. So that is the object's anchor point. So that is the point in which all of these properties are going to keep themselves centered around. So what do I mean by that? So the scale is a really easy one to kind of understand. Wherever I change the scale, it's going to scale from that anchor point as the center. So if I click and just drag and change this number, you can see that it is scaling up or down from that center anchor point. Same thing with the rotation. If I start to rotate that image, it's going to rotate around from that anchor point. So I'm going to undo that. What if I don't want it to rotate from exactly the center? Well, then I'm in luck because you can move that anchor point very easily. So it's by simply just switching to a different tool. So there are a couple different tools up here. The one that I want is called the pan behind or the anchor point tool. It kind of looks like, I think it's supposed to be maybe a marquee with some arrows inside of it. And then if you notice when I hover my pointer over that tool, it also gives me a letter. It's saying Y. That's the shorthand command for that tool. So I can simply hit the Y button and it will switch to activate that tool. You can see that I had the pointer activated. It was blue, and it looks like the button has been kind of pressed down. When I hit the Y button, you'll notice that it switches now to this tool. And also my icon changes. It's a little pointer with that sort of pan behind icon next to it. So now I can click and drag on this anchor point, and I can move it to anywhere I want in my file. I mean, I can even move it off of, I can zoom way out and move the anchor point way out here. And then when I go to rotate it, it's going to rotate from that point. It's also going to scale from that point. So that can be really, really nifty and a really nice way to kind of get some accuracy in your project. Any questions on that so far? You can. It's a little bit of, it's kind of cutting corners and using another tool. So there is a tool in After Effects called a null, which is basically a layer that's empty, but it has an anchor point to it. And so I can create a null layer, which is just under Layer, New, Null Object. So when I do that, you're going to see there is this red layer down here. It's called Null 1. It's got sort of a square, but it also has an anchor point to it. So when I want to adjust this anchor point, I'm not going to use the pan behind tool. I'm going to click back and activate my pointer tool. So the shorthand command for that is V. So if I wanted this null's anchor point to exist sort of at the point of this N, I'm going to set up where I want that anchor point to be first. And then what I'm going to do is something called parenting a layer. So I'm going to parent the logo to that null layer. And you do that by this little spiral thing. It's under parent and link in the timeline. This thing is called a pick whip, which I think is a really interesting term. So I like to use the pick whip. All you have to do is grab the pick whip of the object that you want to parent to, grab it, and point to the object that you want to be the parent. So now when I move this null, I'm actually moving and scaling the PNG. The cool thing about this is that anything that I do, any transformation properties I do to this null, you'll notice like if I scale the null, I'm going to twirl this down. If I bring the scale of the null up, you can see it's at 165, but when I look at the scale of the MTN logo, that one is still at 100. So you can add as many nulls as you want to an object. You just have to set up a system of parenting and kind of remember which object is the parent, which one is the child, or which one drives which one. And then it's kind of a nice way to keep an object nice and clean and put the transformation effects on something else. Plus you can also still rotate the MTN logo, but then you can also rotate the null. So you can kind of have separate rotations. So any questions on that? Okay, so I'm gonna just add some like wacky, like weird little animations on this. I already have the opacity kind of coming up for MTN on top of my footage. I'm gonna just maybe have it sort of scale up and rotate in as well. So I'm gonna start with my timeline again. I'm gonna put it at 0. And then I'm going to activate, actually I'm gonna delete this null because I'm not actually gonna use that layer. So I'm just selecting it and hitting the delete key on my keyboard. So I'm going to click on this logo layer. I'm going to set a keyframe on my scale at 0. I'm going to move forward in time, and I'm just going to kind of follow the keyframes that I already have set. So let's say I want to, at frame 20, I'm going to zoom in just to make sure I'm on top of that keyframe. I can also hold the shift button and it will kind of almost like snap to those keyframes that I already have created. So that's a really nice way to know that I'm right on top of that keyframe. I'm going to go ahead and change the value of the logo. And actually, I want the value of the logo to be 100 at this point in time, and I want it to start at 0. So since I've already created a keyframe here and I know that this keyframe's value is 100, I'm just going to simply click and drag it, and I'm going to hold shift and it will snap and it will kind of land at that point in time. So you can drag keyframes around to kind of change the time that it takes for each keyframe to kind of play out on the timeline. Then I'm going to bring my playhead back to 0, and I'm going to change that value to 0. So now when I hit the spacebar, you can see that my logo sort of scales up as well as fades on. So you can animate multiple channels at once, or multiple properties at once. And let's see, let's do a little bit of rotation as well. So I'm going to have it start at, actually, I want it to land at that 0 rotation. This is going to be like the cheesiest, most 80s looking animation ever. Okay, so we'll have the animation end right there, and I want it to, I'm not sure how much I want to rotate. Sometimes it's just kind of a game of give and take. Also, if I want it to land right there for rotation, but I'm not sure how much I want it to rotate right or left when I go back to my 0, I can move my keyframes around. So I could kind of go forward in time where I can actually see my logo and what it looks like, and then I can kind of mess with the rotation. So let's say I want it to rotate about 180 degrees. So I'm going to change it to 180 degrees, but then I'm just going to grab that keyframe and slide it up to the front. I'm going to hold shift and it will snap to that 0 point in time. Then if I go back to the beginning, voila. There's my beautiful, like, rotated, scaled, and fading on animation. So now there are obviously some more advanced techniques that you can learn in After Effects that will help you to sort of add some polish to these movements so it doesn't look so like 1995 or like out of a box transition that you're kind of just pulling right away, right? But I think we'll kind of leave it as is for now, and maybe if you guys want to know more about it, we could do another one of these sessions, because I'd really like to talk about rendering so you could figure out how to render out your project so you can have something to show for all your work. So let's say that this is my project. This is my whole finished animation. I love it. I love exactly what it's doing, and I want to create like a QuickTime movie or an MP4 or something of this animation. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to render something. So there's a few different ways to do this, but the way that I like to do it is, again, I do a lot of shorthand commands, so I'm going to show you how to do it without that, but just kind of point out where they exist. So if you go to Composition, about halfway down, a little less, there is an option to add to render queue, and it will give you the shorthand command for that. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick that. And then you'll notice down here in the timeline, it switched from my composition to the render queue, and it's giving me a couple of different options. So we'll kind of click on each one of these and we'll talk about them just a little bit. These options you can really get into depth with, and I could do like a whole hour talk about all of these. So I'm just going to talk about some kind of generic ones that will just get you by. And some of you may even know a little bit more about like render settings and output modules, especially if you've done work in Premiere and are really good with film settings. So first of all, I'm just going to talk about, there is a blue word next to a few different options down here. These are actually links to kind of dialog boxes that help you change those menus. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the word Best Settings. So that's going to be my render settings. So if I click on that, it's going to open my render settings window, and it's going to allow me to change a few of these different options. For the most part, for this one, I usually just leave it at its default. So it's going to leave it at best quality. It's going to render it at a full resolution, which I have set up at 1920 by 1080. And I have that set that way because when we dragged this footage down into the timeline, After Effects just set this project to be those same parameters. So if you want to know more about kind of how to set up a project for a specific resolution or dimensions, we can talk about that. I'm super happy to cover that. I guess I sort of skipped over that But yeah, so when you hit best settings, it's just going to kind of look at what your composition is and just set it up to do that. So usually the default on this is okay. Then I'm going to go ahead and look at the output module. So I'm just going to click on the word that says lossless, and it's going to give me the output module settings. Typically what I'm looking for in here is I want to make sure that I'm rendering a QuickTime movie. That's just what I like to render. There are all these different options that you can choose. So you could render out a series of images, like an image sequence. You could make an MP3. I'm just going to go ahead and stick with QuickTime. And then I'm going to click on this button that says Format Options. So what that's going to do is going to allow me to kind of choose different options for the video codec. Again, these codecs are different compressions for the file that you're creating. And so some of you might know more about this than I do. I typically just go with the Apple ProRes 422, but there are lots of different compressions that you can choose. You can also choose no compression if you want. So I typically do the Apple ProRes 422 and just hit OK. And then for the output module settings, usually the rest of these are pretty good. I don't do a lot of work with audio, but you can kind of go and change some of the settings for the audio options as well. Usually the default works just fine for what I need it for. So I'll just go ahead and click OK for that. And then the last one that I like to check is the output to, which is basically just saying like, hey, where do you want to save your project and what do you want to call it? So I'm going to click on that word and it will open up my Save As dialog box. So I will name this MTN logo. And I'm going to just navigate to my desktop so I can save it there so it's really easy for me to find and show you all once I'm done. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Also, one thing I forgot to say is back here in the output module, I'm going to click on that one again. No, just kidding. It is in the best settings. This is going to let you choose how much of your document that you want to actually render out. So I kind of think of it as like when you send a document to a printer to be printed. Let's say you have a 100-page document, but you only want to print like 4 pages. Here you can kind of set things up in After Effects to only render out what you like. So you're going to look for the time span. So right now it's saying work area only, which is what I want. So those in and out points that I set, that sort of like box that encompass just what I wanted for my animation, that's what's being looked at right now to be rendered. I can change this to length of comp, which will then render out all of my comp, but I don't need the whole comp because there's nothing happening kind of outside of my work area. So I'm going to make sure that work area only is checked, and I'm going to hit OK. So once you kind of go through all your settings and get everything going to the way you like it, you can simply just hit the render button. It's a pretty small file, so it shouldn't take too long. And it makes a little chime when it's all finished rendering. So I can go ahead and minimize this After Effects, minimize all my other windows, and I can see that my QuickTime is right here on my desktop. Open it up, make it full screen, and I'll hit play. So there is my QuickTime movie. That is my logo kind of coming in. So any questions on all of that process? Anything you'd like to see again or kind of go over a second time? All right, cool. Well, that's just sort of my whirlwind basics of After Effects. There's a lot of other things that I could talk about or go more in depth in, and I'd be happy to do so if you're interested in it at a later time. So I typically bring them in as an image sequence. And so After Effects, I'll show you really quick if you'd like to see. I think I have one. So I'm going to go back and I'm just going to bring it in with this kind of the waves going on. I'm going to double click in the project window. That's my favorite way to import something in. So I'm just going to double click there. It's going to open up the dialog box. And then you'll have to bear with me while I try to remember where I put this thing. Sorry, I'm trying to remember where I have my stuff saved. Past examples, polygons. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I have this unicorn that I rendered out once long ago. And so I created this animation in Photoshop, and I rendered it out as an image sequence from Photoshop. So my whole animation was about 24 frames long. So you can see each frame was rendered out starting at 100, 101, 102. So in After Effects, if you have a series of images and After Effects recognizes that they are named sequentially, there is this option down here where it will just sort of pick a sequence for you. So you can check this. If you uncheck it, it's just going to bring in whatever image you have highlighted. So it would just bring in this image 100 for me. But if I have the sequence checked, it's going to bring in all of the images in that series as long as it recognizes the numbers. So I'm going to hit open. When I bring that in, you can see the icon's a little bit different. So this one is After Effects' way of saying this is an image sequence. This is frames 100 through 123. And there's a little bit of adjusting that I need to do to that. So when you bring an image sequence into After Effects, by default, After Effects wants to render it at 30 frames per second. So I need to go in and change the frame rate of that image sequence. So I'm right-clicking on it, and I'm going to go to Interpret Footage and choose Main. So this is going to open up another dialog box, and it's going to give me an option to change the frame rate. So here I'm going to go ahead and change it to, I think it was 12. It might have been 24. I honestly don't remember. I'll change it to 12, and then there's an option to loop it, but it's because my screen is really small. It's not allowing me to see that. Let me see if I can hide my dock, and then we can maybe see it. We'll do that. There we go. So the loop option is down here. I'm going to go ahead and just say loop it 10 times. I'm not sure how much time that's going to give me, but I'm just kind of guessing. So I'll hit OK, hit Enter. I could have hit the OK box, but it was hiding off of my screen. So just simply hitting Enter will allow that to input all of those changes. And I'm going to click and drag this down into my timeline. So it's going to release it, and it will put the image sequence that I have here just wherever it is, depending on how big or small it is, with an anchor point in the center of it. I'm going to turn off the logo just for clarity's sake, and then if I hit the space bar, it's going to kind of go through all of those images. It's going to think about it first for a little bit, and then it'll play it at real time. So it looks like I think I did this one at 24 frames per second because that looks a little bit small to me, or slow, sorry. Let me go in and change that frame rate again so you can kind of see the difference. So this one's at 12. Again, if I right click on this and choose main, I'm going to just change this to 24 frames per second. I'll leave the loop at 10, even though that'll cut it in half for how long it plays. And I'll simply hit return. And then when I hit the space bar again, you'll see that that timing has changed just a little bit. So that one looks a little bit more normal to me. So when I'm doing hand-drawn animation, I typically work in something like Photoshop, and then I will render out an image sequence, and then I'll bring it into After Effects. And I'll make sure I have a transparent background so I can kind of build up like my background and maybe bring in a foreground or other objects and elements and kind of work that way. Yeah, any questions on that process? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, that's pretty much all I have for kind of the basics, so yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
And yes, I would like to have you.
Okay, yeah, certainly. I'd love to come back and talk a little bit about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.